Would you like a petticoat like this? Or perhaps one like this one? Then this is your lucky day, because this cool cat will teach you how. So keep watching, because you're watching the Petticoated Swashbuckler. First, we need some measurements. If you're planning to wear your petticoat over a pair of hoops or a false rump and you don't want it riding up the sides like the petticoat on my mannequin does, you need to measure from the waist over the widest part of your rump or petticoat and down to the floor, or however long you want it. You then need to measure from the waist to the floor where there is no hoop or rump. I'll show you why later. If you're not planning on wearing any skirt supports underneath, you can just skip the first measurement and only use the second one. Always make sure your tailor's cat is happy. The next bit is a little tricky to show you on fabric, because fabric is big and I am but small, but I'll show you on a drawing instead. 150 centimeters is the width of my fabric. If your fabric is a lot narrower, you might have to combine 3 or even 4 widths to get the circumference that you want. Now I measured over my hoops down to the floor as 122 centimeters. So I am going to need 2 pieces of fabric of this size. Now the front measurement was quite a bit shorter, 105 centimeters. So I'm drawing a line here on my drawing that is down the middle of my skirt panel and a bit shorter than the side lengths. As you can see, it's quite a big difference between the 122 centimeters on each side and the 105 centimeters in the middle. Now, to get an even hanging hem, we need to do something up here. We could of course just cut it away, but that's not a very period thing to do because fabric was expensive and you wanted to keep as much of it as possible in case you needed to redo your petticoats later if fashions changed, and they did. So instead we're going to fold it down. On my white petticoat I'll show you that you can just fold it down, baste it down, and that's it. But on the green petticoat I had to make a small cut, a small slit, where I'm drawing a line right now. Just to make sure that it laid nicely and didn't bulk up funnily in the front and the back. Remember that these are my measurements and I'm quite tall, so your measurements might be different. The first petticoat is made from a quite fine, thin wool that's very drapey. So here I've just folded the diagonal lines on the top edge down and basted them. And I don't think I'm going to have to cut a slit. To make sure that it hangs evenly and that there's no funny bulk because I don't have a slit, I just pleated it roughly onto my mannequin and it looks fine. By the way, pleating in the period was rarely mathematically precise, so if yours isn't, don't fret, you're just being historically plausible. Now what I like to do when I've finished adjusting the top edge, if needed, is to sew together the side seams. So I leave an opening at the top, maybe 15 to 20 centimeters, for the pocket slits, and then I just sew down the sides. This fabric is so sturdy and has such a nice selvage and is not prone to fraying, so I'm just doing a simple running back stitch. And when I'm done with that, I'm going to cut away half of the seam allowance on one side and fold both sides to one side, and then I'm just whip stitching or hem stitching my seam allowances to the skirt, and this makes for a very flat and neat and sturdy seam. Now it's time to hem the pocket slits, and I've just done that by folding the selvages in and hem stitching them down. And of course, if the selvages weren't as nice as they are on this fabric, I would probably have folded them in twice to hide the raw edges, but there's no need for that here, and I'm not going to make this more difficult than it needs to be. No one's going to study the inside of my pocket slits anyway. So I'm just hem stitching that down, And of course, where the two panels meet and join is a point that might need to take some stress depending on how roughly I reach into my pockets. So I like to enforce this a little bit with a few whip stitches. And when it's all done, the hemmed pocket slits will look like this. And this is the inside. Both pocket slits done, it's time for the hem. I've just folded the hem in and basted it down, and also folded in both sides of my facing. It's horsehair linen that I'm using today. And this is going to be placed a few millimeters in from the edge of the skirt and just basted in place. And when that's done, I'm prick stitching, or this is also known as whip prick stitching, the facing to the petticoat. And this is done by creating tiny little prick stitches on the front of the fabric. But then when you go through facing, you are whipping over the edge. And this is makes for a very neat and sturdy and fine seam. And when I've gone all the way around, I like to use what's called a Dutch stitch to close up the join in the facings, and that's done by pushing your needle through the folded edge of the facing and up through the top layer, and then you sort of whip it over and you push it through the folded edge on the other side and up through the top layer, and this makes for a very flat and nice seam. It's sometimes known as the fishbone seam. Now it's time to fasten the top edge of the facing to the skirt. I'm using a hem stitch, making sure only to catch some of the inner fuss on the wool so it's not visible from the outside. And when that's done all around, it's time to remove all the basting stitches, and the hem is done. Time to do the pleating on the front and the back. This is the front with a big box pleat in the front and knife pleats toward the pocket slits. And the back has a big inverted box pleat mid-back, and then more knife pleats but toward the back and away from the pocket slits. The time has come to attach the waistband. When I came to this part, I realized that having first folded over the top edge and then pleated it down, I had 10 or even 11 layers of wool to sew through some places. So I decided to go over a whip stitch in an attempt to squeeze it down and make it less bulky. I kind of regretted it later, I'll show you. But when you're making the waistband, you can make that from bias tape, as I'll show you later, or from self or some other fabric. You need your waist measurement, divide it by 2, add a few centimeters, and then you need 2 of those, one for the front and one for the back panel. I used the same wool as I used in the petticoat for mine. I've just placed it here, right sides together with the front of the skirt. And when that was done, I folded up the waistband. And this is what I'd usually do. I'd fold in the raw edges, then place it over the raw edges on the back of the skirt. But can you see how bulky that gets? Maybe not, but it was like a centimeter of bulk. I don't want that at my waistline. That will not be nice. So I moved it up a bit and decided to just Dutch stitch it together like I showed you earlier. That being done, I attached ribbons, 4 of them, 2 on the front, 2 on the back, where the waistband now looks a bit like tube. And the first petticoat is done. Let's move on to the next one. The silk taffeta behaves so differently from the wool, so I had to make that cut in the top that I showed you earlier. But after having folded down the top edge and basted it in place, I went and did the side seams as per usual for me. I used what's called a mantua maker's seam, where you fold both the raw edges to one side and baste them down, and then you fold them again to hide the raw edges and baste that down too if you like, and then you sew through all layers using a hem stitch or a prick stitch. And I've never done this before, but it was very efficient. I like it. Having done both sides this way and hemmed both of the pocket slits the way we did on the white petticoat, it was time to do the hem, and I did that the same way as the white petticoat as well, only using a narrower strip. And instead of the horsehair linen, I used a print cotton. And as you can see, it is barely visible from the front. I pleated the skirt the same way we did the white petticoat, and instead of using a self fabric waistband, I'm just using a bias tape and backstitching that in from the front. And then I'm folding it over to the inside, and it's because the taffeta behaves differently from the wool, it's still not very bulky. You're not exactly hiding the raw edges. The raw edges are there, they're the yellowy tasseled things you see, but it's more about creating a waistline that won't add bulk to your waistline. And when I'm just hem stitching down the bias tape to the inside, it just does exactly that. Add lacing ribbons to the front and the back, and we are done! Oh yeah, and I actually made a pair of sleeves for my stays for this outfit. I thought stays with sleeves on was a strictly 17th and, you know, maybe early 18th century thing, but Anne Bamford's inventory actually includes 2 sets of sleeves, and I have no idea what else they would have been used for, so I don't know, maybe they held their sway for longer than we thought. Maybe Anne Bamford was just older than I have anticipated and held on to the fashions of her youth for longer. I don't know. But anyway, they were great fun to make. A tiny little project that took just like half a day. And I mean, who doesn't love a lot of big fluffy bows? Or even a tiny little one, just down there at the elbow dart. I hope you've enjoyed this tiny little tutorial. Apologies for making it so much shorter than my videos usually are, and many apologies for it coming out so much later than it should have, but I've been fairly busy with a project that I hope I'll be able to show you fairly soon. But for now, be kind, be creative, stay safe, and be back.